Here's an experiment. Take every disadvantage a man carries just for being a man. Every place where he's treated as expendable, as background noise, as a line item instead of a person, and ask one question about each one. What would happen if this were happening to women instead? Not as a gotcha, not as bitterness, as a mirror. Because some things are so normalized that the only way to actually see them is to imagine them landing on someone the culture has already decided it cares about. This is Robbin, and this is the Honest Ledger. Today we're running that exact experiment, one domain at a time. And at the end, we're going to add it all up and ask what it actually costs a man to live inside a set of double standards he's been trained not to even notice. One thing needs to be said clearly, and I'll only say it once. This isn't a video against women, and it's not an argument that women's suffering doesn't matter or doesn't deserve the response it gets. It does. This is a test of consistency. Whether the same urgency and compassion this culture extends automatically to female suffering gets extended to male suffering when the numbers are equal or worse. If the answer is no, that's not an attack on anyone. That's just an honest entry in the ledger. Let's open the books. The first entry in the ledger is legal disposability, and there's no cleaner example of it than selective service. Every young man in this country at 18 is required by law to register, under penalty of losing access to federal student aid, federal employment, and in some cases, facing prosecution. The entire purpose of that registration is so the government knows where to find him if it ever needs bodies for combat. Women are not required to register. That's not an accidental gap in the law. It's a deliberate one, built on the quiet assumption that in a crisis, a man's life is available to be spent and a woman's is not. Now run the mirror. Picture that requirement reversed. Women legally required to register at 18, facing prosecution for refusing, subject to combat assignment without the option to decline. That wouldn't quietly exist in the background of American life. It would be the defining civil rights fight of a generation, in court within weeks, in the streets within months. What this costs a young man is something almost nobody names out loud to him at 18. The state has already decided, before he's old enough to vote in some cases, that his body belongs to it under the right conditions. On the ledger, his life held in legal reserve. Against a status quo nobody's fighting to change because it was never framed as anyone's emergency. And the strangest part of this entry is how quietly it's absorbed. Most 18-year-old men fill out that registration between other errands, barely registering that they've just agreed in writing that their body is available to the state under conditions they don't get to negotiate. Compare that to almost any other legal obligation of that magnitude, and you'd expect it to come with warnings, counseling, some acknowledgement of what's actually being signed. Instead, it's paperwork. That's not because the stakes are low. It's because the stakes have been normalized to the point of invisibility. The second entry is dying at work. Something in the range of 5,000 people die in workplace accidents in this country every year, and that figure has held roughly steady for years. 5,000 families losing a father, a brother, a son, concentrated almost entirely in construction, logging, fishing, mining, and transportation, jobs that are dangerous and jobs that are overwhelmingly done by men. Now run the mirror. Imagine 5,000 women a year dying on the job in female-dominated industries. Picture the congressional hearings, the OSHA overhaul, the documentaries, the advocacy organizations formed within a news cycle. We know exactly what that response would look like because we've watched this culture respond with real urgency when female physical safety is perceived to be at risk. When men die on the job, there's a settlement, some paperwork, and the world moves on. What this costs the men doing that work is that their deaths are absorbed as an operating cost rather than treated as the emergency 5,000 deaths a year would be treated as in any other context. On the ledger, 5,000 lives a year, entered as a line item instead of a headline. Compare that to how quickly workplace conditions get scrutinized the moment a story involves a female victim in a female-dominated field, and the gap in response isn't about the danger of the work. It's about whose danger this culture has been trained to treat as newsworthy. The third entry is the life expectancy gap itself. Men die, on average, somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 years earlier than women, a gap that's persisted for generations and involves a mix of factors: more dangerous work, higher rates of physical risk-taking, lower rates of seeking medical care, and higher suicide rates, all feeding into the same number. Now run the mirror. If women were dying 5 to 6 years earlier than men, this wouldn't be a topic for a calm academic panel. It would be treated as a public health emergency with research funding, awareness campaigns, and policy attached to it at speed. When the gap runs the direction it actually runs, the conversation tends to stop at, well, men make certain choices, as if an explanation for a gap is the same thing as a justification for tolerating it. It isn't. What this costs the average man is years of life that never get treated as a crisis worth solving, because the crisis happened to land on the wrong gender to generate that kind of urgency. On the ledger, 5 to 6 years, quietly written off as a footnote rather than a public health priority. The fourth entry is the legal system itself, and this one should sit uncomfortably with anyone who actually believes in equal treatment under the law. Research on sentencing disparities, most notably a widely cited study led by economist Sonia Starr, has found that men tend to receive meaningfully longer sentences than women for comparable offenses and similar criminal histories, with estimates in some of that research running as high as several times the gap you'd expect from the facts of the case alone. Exact figures vary study to study, so treat the specific number as directional rather than gospel, but the pattern itself has held up across multiple pieces of research. Now run the mirror. If the disparity ran the other way, if women were consistently receiving dramatically longer sentences than men for identical crimes, there is no universe where that stays quiet. It becomes a fundamental justice issue overnight. When it runs the direction it actually runs, the data gets published, and the policy response is largely silence. What this costs a man standing in front of a judge is a system that treats his gender as an aggravating factor it will never admit to weighing. On the ledger, months or years of additional time priced in based on a variable that has nothing to do with what he actually did. This is also one of the clearest cases where the data is inconvenient, seems to explain the silence better than the data doesn't exist. The research has been published, cited, and largely left to sit because a sentencing gap that disadvantages men doesn't generate the same reform pressure that an identical gap running the other direction would generate almost overnight. The fifth entry is family court, and this is one a lot of men on this channel already know in their bones. A man who's spent years as a present father and a faithful provider walks into a courtroom and discovers the default assumption is that the children belong primarily with their mother, that the burden of proof runs backward, and he has to argue his way into equal time with kids he's been raising the whole way through. Now run the mirror. If mothers walked into family court and discovered fathers got primary custody as the default in the clear majority of cases, that weekend visitation was treated as generous, that years of motherhood could end with a support obligation paid to an ex-husband who'd already moved on, there would not be a functioning court system left standing by morning. That response would be entirely justified because what's being described is a genuine injustice. It's also, in reverse, close to what plays out for fathers every day, with nowhere near that level of organized opposition, because men have largely been conditioned to absorb this kind of unfairness quietly instead of naming it. What this costs a man is potentially his relationship with his own children, filtered through a presumption he never agreed to and rarely gets to challenge on equal footing. On the ledger, years of active fatherhood weighed against a courtroom default that assumes his role was secondary from the start, and this entry compounds in a way the others don't, because the burden of proof runs backward at exactly the moment a man is least equipped to fight it, mid-divorce, financially strained, emotionally depleted, up against a system whose starting assumption he has to spend money and time simply to challenge before the actual argument about his fitness as a father even begins. The sixth entry is education, and this is one of the clearest examples of a mobilized response existing on one side of a gap and going dormant on the other. Decades ago, when women were underrepresented in higher education, the response was real and structural. Title IX, targeted scholarships, recruiting programs, institutional change aimed squarely at closing the gap. That mobilization worked. The gap didn't just close, it reversed, and it's kept widening. Women now complete college at meaningfully higher rates than men in many countries, with estimates commonly citing something in the range of a 20-point gap in degree completion, and boys falling behind earlier too, in high school graduation and college attendance both. Now run the mirror. If that 20-point gap still ran in the direction it used to run, favoring men, does anyone believe the institutional machinery that built Title IX would have gone quiet by now? It wouldn't have. When the gap reversed, the mobilization didn't follow it, because the narrative of boys falling behind doesn't fit cleanly into the frameworks currently used to talk about educational equity. What this costs an entire generation of young men is narrowed opportunity and reduced earning potential, compounding forward for decades, while the mechanisms that fix the reverse version of this problem sit largely unused. On the ledger, a generation's worth of educational ground, lost to a gap nobody's organizing to close, because it points the wrong direction for the current conversation. The machinery that fixed this exact problem when it ran the other way still exists. The funding structures, the institutional playbooks, the political will to treat an education gap as an emergency. None of that disappeared. It simply pointed somewhere else, while the boys currently falling behind in elementary school grow into the men who'll be the subject of the next several entries on this list. The 7th entry is suicide, and this is the one most likely to actually break your heart if you sit with the real number for a second instead of skimming past it. Men die by suicide at roughly 4 times the rate of women in most developed countries where this is tracked, not somewhat higher, 4 times. That's not a rounding error in a public health data set. That's an enormous ongoing loss of fathers, sons, and brothers, playing out largely in silence because male suicide tends to get filed as a men's issue rather than a human one, and men's issues consistently receive less institutional urgency than equivalent crises framed around women. Now run the mirror. If women were dying by suicide at 4 times the rate of men, it's not hard to picture what that would generate. Sustained federal funding, national campaigns, crisis infrastructure built at scale, and a permanent place in the cultural conversation. What this costs the men living through that gap is a crisis that never gets treated with the scale of resources its actual numbers would justify anywhere else. On the ledger, an entire category of preventable loss, chronically under-resourced relative to its actual size. What makes this entry particularly hard to sit with is that it isn't a mystery in the way some public health crises are. A meaningful portion of it traces directly back to entries already on this ledger. Men who don't seek care until conditions are severe. Men who've been trained their whole lives to treat asking for help as a form of failure. Men absorbing the draft's disposability in the workplace's danger, and the courtroom's presumption without a cultural permission slip to ever say any of it was hard. The suicide numbers aren't separate from the rest of this list. They're closer to the final invoice. The 8th entry covers 2 numbers that belong together because they both describe the same kind of physical disposability, homelessness and homicide. Men make up something in the range of 7 out of every 10 people experiencing homelessness in this country, and roughly 3/4 to 4/5 of homicide victims, the overwhelming majority of people sleeping on the street, and the overwhelming majority of people being murdered are men. And both numbers get treated as background noise rather than a defining crisis. Now run the mirror on either one. If 70% of the homeless population were women, that would be treated, correctly, as one of the defining social failures of the era. If women were being murdered at anywhere close to the rate men actually are, the cultural conversation around violence would center it completely. Violence against women is a real and serious problem that deserves the attention it receives. That's not in dispute here. What's also true is that male victimization, at a scale that dwarfs the comparison, barely registers as a story at all. What this costs individual men is straightforward. When it happens to you, it's statistically less likely to generate a headline, an investigation with the same intensity, or a community response with the same weight. On the ledger, physical safety and housing stability, treated as expendable in a way that would be unthinkable if the numbers described women instead. The 9th entry is the one underneath almost everything else on this list, and it's cultural rather than statistical. Handle it standard, and the version of masculinity that gets broadcast constantly in mainstream entertainment. Watch enough sitcoms and commercials and you'll find the same character on a loop: the husband who can't work the dishwasher, the dad who turns an afternoon alone with the kids into a disaster, the bumbling man who requires his competent, eye-rolling wife to manage basic domestic life. If that exact genre existed with the genders reversed, if the incompetent, eye-roll-worthy adult were reliably the woman in every sitcom and every ad, That would not survive as an acceptable genre for more than one advertising cycle. Underneath that portrayal is a real standard most men absorb from childhood. When it's hard, you handle it. When you're in pain, you manage it. When you need help, you find a way to need it less. That standard produces real capability, and it also produces men who don't seek medical care until conditions are severe, who carry weight alone because asking for help was coded as failure long before they had the words to question it. Now, run the mirror on that standard too. Tell women, as a blanket cultural rule, that emotional expression is weakness, and the measure of a real woman is her ability to absorb pain silently. That would be recognized immediately as harmful and regressive, and it would be right to recognize it that way. Applied to men, it's just as harmful, and the suicide and life expectancy numbers from earlier in this ledger are, in part, the receipt for it. What this costs a man is the version of himself that never gets to say the hard thing out loud, because he learned early that saying it would cost him standing rather than earn him support. On the ledger, an entire emotional register spent down over a lifetime that nobody ever taught him he was allowed to keep. Add it all up, and here's the full ledger. What gets extracted from men across nearly every domain this culture measures: legal disposability written into law at 18, 5,000 lives a year absorbed as an operating cost, 5 to 6 years of life expectancy treated as an explainable footnote, sentences measurably longer for the same crimes, a courtroom presumption that treats fatherhood as secondary by default, a generational education gap nobody's mobilizing to close, a suicide rate 4 times higher than the group that receives the bulk of public health urgency, a wildly disproportionate share of homelessness and homicide treated as background noise, and a cultural script that trains an entire gender not to ask for help until the cost of that silence shows up in every statistic before it. Run the mirror on any single one of these and the response would be immediate, organized, and treated as a moral emergency. Run it on all 9 together, and the actual response so far has mostly been quiet. Here's what you actually do with this, because a list of injustices without a next step is just a longer way of feeling powerless. First, name it in your own life, specifically out loud to someone who will actually hear it. Not as a competition with anyone else's suffering, but as an honest accounting of your own. The habit of staying quiet is the same habit that keeps every entry on this list invisible at the individual level. And it starts small the first time you say, "That was actually hard," instead of "It's fine" to someone you trust. Second, get informed on the entries that could actually touch your life directly. Know your rights and your actual legal exposure in family court before you need to. Understand the real numbers behind male health disparities well enough to take your own care seriously. And don't wait for a crisis to make the case for prevention that the data has already made clearly enough on its own. Third, seek care before conditions are severe, especially around anything physical or mental you've been quietly managing alone. The Handle It standard has a body count attached to it, and you don't have to be part of that number to prove anything to anyone. Fourth, push back on the reflexive comic portrayal of men as incompetent buffoons when you see it, calmly and specifically, the same way you'd expect any group to push back on a flattening stereotype. Not with outrage, just with the observation that it's a double standard and it's worth naming as one. Fifth, extend the same seriousness to men's issues that you'd extend automatically to anyone else's. In conversations, in how you vote on policy that touches these areas, in how you respond when a man in your life finally says the hard thing out loud. Consistency is the actual test here, not sympathy for one side over the other. And sixth, remember that naming a double standard clearly is not the same thing as declaring war on the people who benefit from it. It's the first step toward a response that's actually proportional to what the numbers describe, for men and for anyone else the numbers point to. None of this is a call to take anything away from women, and none of it is bitterness dressed up as analysis. It's a consistency test, applied honestly, entry by entry, until the ledger actually balances. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments, not just agreement. Which entry on this list landed hardest for you personally, and is there one you'd add that wasn't on it? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this is the first place you've heard these entries laid out side by side instead of one at a time, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up, one entry at a time.